Okay, so one of the first and most important elements to creating cinematic images is learning great composition. Composition meaning the placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a photo or frame of video. In other words, just as food has ingredients to make it taste good, an image has ingredients to make it look aesthetically pleasing or beautiful. So I want to share with you my top 10 rules of composition. Now understand there are more elements than just these top 10 rules, and we'll be talking about many of them in later videos, and that these are more of guidelines than rules. Rules are made to be broken, and I'll be the first to tell you that I love breaking the rules, but you can't break them if you don't know them, so pay attention. Rule number 1 is to fill the frame. This is one of the biggest problems I see plaguing beginning filmmakers is they don't fill the frame with the subject. There's too much dead space of unimportant details, and the main subjects are just too small in the frame. Now, if you want a wide shot showing all of the surrounding details, that's one thing, but if your shot is supposed to be focused on a specific subject, then you have two options: either zoom in or get closer. The latter, getting closer, is almost always going to be your best option, so don't get lazy capturing footage from a distance. Where possible, get up in the action and fill your frame with your subject. This is one of the things that separates my films from others, is that I like to get right up in the action to make my viewers feel like they are actually there, rather than being off in the distance with my subject tiny in the frame. But point is, be purposeful with what you choose to include in your frame, and if it's not helping tell your story, zoom in or get closer to fill the frame with your subject that you are wanting the viewer to focus on. But it's not only about what's in your frame, it's also about what's not in your frame. For example, in this shot, the subject is filling the frame just fine, but what else is filling the frame? This guy, that lady, this cooler, none of these things really matter or pertain to what we want the viewer to be focused on, which is the couple. It just distracts us from the couple. So ask yourself if the background is adding or distracting from your story, and if it's distracting, eliminate it. Rule number 2 is the rule of thirds, and it basically means to chop your frame into thirds and put points of interest and importance on one of these lines. When working with landscapes, you usually want to try and put your horizon on one of the two horizontal lines on either the top third or the bottom third, depending on what's more important. Do you want your viewer to be focused on the sky, or do you want them to be focused on the land? When working with people, you want to try and keep them in one of the vertical lines and try and keep their eye line around that top third, and be sure to give them enough lead room or looking room, which means whichever way they're looking, you want to put more space in front of them than you do behind them. Also, be aware of headroom. This is the distance between the head and the top of the image. You generally don't want to cut off people's faces, and you also don't want to give them too much space above their head. You want to try and keep that head around that top third of your image. The exception to this rule would be unconventional framing, where you're purposefully giving too much headroom because there's something of importance that you want to show off above them, but make sure to have a creative reason for why you're doing that so it doesn't come across as just bad framing. And if you're doing a tighter shot where you can't fit the whole head on the frame, then obviously there's no choice but to cut off their head, and in this case it's better to cut off more of the top of the head rather than too much of the chin and mouth, because being able to see the mouth moving when people are talking is much more important than being able to see their hair. Basically, for those tight shots, try and keep the eyes on the top third and the mouth on the bottom third. Now, not everything needs to or should be framed using the rule of thirds. Sometimes you'll want your image to have equal visual weight, which brings us to our third rule, which is symmetry. You'll notice that in a lot of my tutorials, I frame myself on the third and position my body facing slightly towards frame right. But in this current setup, I square up my body to be facing directly towards the camera, so I frame myself in the middle. And usually if my subject is facing more towards one side, I'll give them more looking room towards the way they're facing. But if they're squared up facing directly into the camera, I'll frame them in the center. Also, because these background lights are very symmetrical, it would look awkward to have more room on one side or the other. So depending on the elements within your image, it can sometimes make more sense to frame symmetrically rather than on one of the thirds. For example, here's a symmetrical image that I shot in Mexico. Usually I would frame my horizon on a third, but in this clip, because there's water reflecting all of these trees, we have a very symmetrical image, so I framed my horizon in the middle so that you could see the reflection equally on the bottom. So pay attention to your image, and when you find opportunities to have symmetry, make sure to frame accordingly. Moving on to rule number 4 is to create depth. And there's a few ways you can create depth, and we'll discuss many of those throughout the rest of this course, but probably the two most common ways to create depth are to use a lower aperture and to use foreground. I personally love shooting at low apertures, like at a 2.8 or lower, and the reason being that when you use a low aperture, it knocks your background out of focus and gives you a shallow depth of field, thus creating more depth to your image. Take a look at this side-by-side example. There's people in the background of both of these shots, but you can't tell in the shot on the left because the background is out of focus. By bringing your aperture down, this helps your viewer focus on the subject and not get distracted by unimportant details in the background. But shooting at a lower aperture doesn't do much for your image unless you have a foreground object and a background object. Always look for opportunities to add layers to your image. So anytime I'm glide camming, I'm always looking for some kind of foreground to glide up against to make my image feel more three-dimensional. Moving on to rule number 5 is leading lines, which means use leading lines to lead your eye into the center of the image or into your subject. Lines are a very powerful visual aid to help draw your eye into the subject, and they can also contribute to creating depth as well. So again, when I'm shooting, I'm always looking for bridges or fences or any natural lines around me that I can use to create depth to my image and lead my viewer's eye towards the center of the image or towards my subject. Rule number 6 is to balance diagonally, which basically means when using the rule of thirds and you have your main subject on a third, this can sometimes leave an empty space in the other third, resulting in an unbalanced image. So I always try and balance the weight of my subject by including another object to fill on the other third. So for example, in this image you're seeing right now, I have a microphone stand filling up the top third of this image, but it felt a little bit unbalanced to not have anything on this side. So I brought in my computer to fill in this bottom third, which makes the image feel more balanced. So this diagonal principle states that the most important parts of an image or main subjects should be placed along this imaginary diagonal line drawn across your image. Moving on to rule number 7 is patterns and repetition. Patterns and repetition are aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and you will often find them in man-made buildings and structures. So as a cinematographer, I'm always on the lookout for patterns and shapes and lines and anything that can make my image look more interesting. Rule number 8 is framing. This is one that I see a lot of people struggle with as well, is they don't pay attention to the framing and they have crooked lines or tilted horizons or barely cutting something out of the frame or barely including something that doesn't need to be in the frame. Pay attention to everything that's in your frame and use the natural lines that you see in your image to help guide your framing to make it look more professional. Obviously, there's times when you'll disregard this, like if you're using a Dutch angle shot, which means you're purposefully angling the camera off horizon in an attempt to make your audience feel uneasy or disoriented, but otherwise, try and keep your lines in your image vertical and horizontal in your frame. Rule number 9 is dominant subject. This is a huge one. Probably one of the biggest mistakes I see beginners make is they don't have a clear dominant subject in their image. Take for example this image and tell me what you think the dominant subject is. What are you supposed to be looking at? Is it the tarp hanging off the balcony? Is it the bike? This image makes me so confused because I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking at. There's no dominant subject, which makes it a very poorly composed image. Using some of the rules we've talked about already, you can help your viewer know what the dominant subject should be by filling your frame with the subject, using the rule of thirds or of symmetry, using leading lines to draw your viewer's eyes into a specific point, using a lower aperture to help blur out unimportant details, and so on. Going back to our good and bad example of the two wedding shots, they both did a great job at filling the frame with the dominant subject, but it's a lot easier to focus on the bride and groom on the left because everything behind them is knocked out of focus, whereas the image on the right, there are people walking in the background and they're all just as in focus as the couple because they used a higher aperture. So the subject is less dominant by allowing the background to also be in focus. And I see this issue a lot with drone shots. People are so far away from their subject that the audience doesn't know where to look. You can start by either framing the horizon on either the top or bottom third, which will immediately tell your audience if they should be looking at the sky or the ground. Then if you can find foreground like trees, thus helping guide your audience to the main subject. And of course, make sure to get as close to your subject as possible, filling the whole frame and omitting things from your frame that distract from the subject. Again, there's obviously times when you want wide shots to show off all your surrounding subjects, but again, be purposeful with what you choose to keep in your frame and what you choose to omit to make it easy for the viewer to identify what the dominant subject is. And moving on to our last tip, number 10, is focus. If you follow all of these rules of composition, but your image is not in focus, then it's probably not going to be usable. For example, here's a shot I took of this couple at a wedding, and when I got back in the editing room, I realized that they're not in focus. His shoulder was in focus, but their faces are not. So I had to cut this out of the edit and find a different shot where their faces were in focus. Another good example of focus was this music video I shot of the Gardner sisters. I did a close-up of one of them singing with an aperture at 1.4 using manual focus, and somewhere within their performance, she moved positions and came out of focus, and so for the rest of the take, she was out of focus, so that shot was unusable. So I had her do another take, told her not to move this time so that I could get her eyes in focus, and that made all the difference. And this is why I love using in-video autofocus like Canon's dual pixel, is because it ensures that all of your shots will be perfectly in focus and allow you to use a lot more of your takes because you're not having to throw some some of them out because they're slightly out of focus. So I highly recommend getting a camera that has good autofocus like newer Canon or Sony cameras. And if you're using a camera like a Red that doesn't have autofocus, you'll have to make sure and pay close attention to every shot to make sure it's in focus. And we have a full video in this section giving you all my tips for keeping focus with and without autofocus. But there you have it, guys. Those are my top 10 rules for composition. These aren't the only elements that make up a cinematic image, but 10 of the most important to be aware of. Again, there are other equally important elements to great composition, but they have their own videos like lighting, camera angles, focal length. So make sure to continue watching throughout the rest of this section to learn the rest of the elements to creating cinematic images. But that's it for my top 10 rules. If you guys have any further questions, please let me know.